It is a joy to be with you this afternoon, and I know that everyone will stay awake at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right after lunch, but it is a blessing to be with you, to be able to worship the Lord together. It has been said about the story of Ruth that Ruth embodies a diamond in a time of darkness. And sometimes the books of Judges and Ruth seem so very different to us, so different, we don't even think about any kind of correlation. And yet, in Ruth chapter 1, you might notice with me the very opening verse we read, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land." And so the judges were governing in Israel, and we have this story of Ruth. And she seems like such a bright light. And the story of Boaz, and in many ways Naomi, as we'll talk more about her, as well as Ruth, and God using them to his glory. And yet we think about the book of Judges. And if the book of Judges was put into a movie format, I have to tell you, I have a feeling it wouldn't be PG. There are some very graphic things there in the book of Judges. And the reason they are there is not only is the historical account being revealed to us, but what we are seeing is how dark and how difficult the days are when God's people abandon him or rebel against him. And of course, we see a cycle that takes place in the leadership and among the people. And the more people leave the Lord, the more they apostatize, just the darker things seem to be. And you see at the very beginning in Judges 2, probably one of the more well-known passages to many of us in the book of Judges, that even though Joshua had been faithful to God, and those who had witnessed what Joshua had done, we read that there arose another generation which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. You know, I can remember even as a little boy, I know some of you are wondering if I ever was a little boy, but I was a little boy at one time, and I remember gospel preachers and Bible class teachers, and rightfully so, it bears repeating, making the statement that we are always only one generation away from apostasy. And so we have to understand that just because they're our children or our grandchildren doesn't guarantee that they will be right with the Lord. Each person, each generation, each family has to be taught and has to be educated regarding salvation and regarding the Lord and regarding the God that we serve. And we see that both in the Old Testament and we see it in the New Testament. Fathers are to nurture their children in the admonition of the Lord. They're to demonstrate that love by teaching them and disciplining them. Godly parents are to do so. And so we understand what happens when people depart from God, and we see that in Judges, and we see some very graphic scenes that embody and demonstrate that very truth to us. And yet in the middle of all of that, we have this story of Ruth. And so we're going to think about what we need to learn. And anytime we read any book of the Bible, it is critical that we ask the right questions and we have the right objectives. And one of the fundamental questions is, what do I learn about God? What do I learn about what God would have me to do? How can I grow closer to the Lord as a result of reading this and understanding this? And this is no exception. So out of this time of spiritual anarchy and rebellion, we yet read a story of loyalty and faithfulness. And we see the promise fulfilled when God would say, even as the Hebrew writer would record it, for he himself has said, I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. So as we think about this story, I want to suggest to you there is the story, and then there is the story within the story. And a lot of us are familiar with just the story. And a lot of the times when we talk about Ruth, I can tell you how some people respond, maybe not everybody. But some people respond by saying, oh, I love the story of Ruth. And if I were to ask, why do you love the story of Ruth? They would say something like, I don't know, it touches my heart. It's such a romantic story. Look, I preached those sermons too about dating and finding a spouse and all of that, and there's some wonderful things to learn from this story about that. So I'm not denying there's that aspect of it. I'm just telling you I don't think that's the primary aspect of this. So if we don't get the story within the story, we end up missing what was intended for us. So you might say, well, what's the story within the story? Well, let's go at it this way. If I asked you, who is the primary character in this story? Now, I know some of you are probably going to say, I knew people were slow from Arkansas, but this is a little ridiculous. Because at the top of my Bible, it says this is the book of Ruth. But I would submit to you that Ruth is not the primary character of this story. Somebody says, well, are you thinking Naomi? No, Naomi's not the primary character. Oh, you're a little bit on the chauvinistic side, Bruce is. So you're thinking it's Boaz. Boaz is powerful and important in many ways to this story. Can't have the story without Boaz. And I think you could argue that he foreshadows the Christ to come as our Redeemer. And you can't have the story without Boaz or Naomi or Ruth. But you know already the primary character in this story, and if we don't get this, we don't get it, is God. God is the primary story, and it is a love story. It's a love story between God and his people. That is the story within the story of God's faithfulness to his people. And what we're going to see also is really the fingerprints of God all over the place. And we're going to find, and this is the beauty of this story, that God providentially is going to use even Ruth, who's considered an outsider. She's a Moabitess, and you'll see this over and over in this book. The Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess. So even in the Old Testament, here is a woman that by many would have been considered an outsider. And yet God's faithfulness is coming through her. There's Naomi, and you might say Naomi would have been somewhat representative of Israelites and of God's people, but there's love coming through her for Ruth. And then there's Boaz, a deliverer of sorts, a redeemer, and you see God's redemption and faithfulness coming through him. And if we don't get that, we're really missing the power and the changing nature of this particular story. And so I hope that it will help us. It will help us to see the light of God's glory even in the darkest of times, just as we read in this particular account. Now, I remember literature class, and maybe you do too. Not a whole lot of literature class, but I remember a little bit of it. You remember those stories you would read when you were in school, and they kind of gave you, they eased into this, and it built up, and you have this building up, and finally you're going to hit the climax of the story, maybe about halfway in, and you're going to have conflict and climax, and then you have the resolution. That's not exactly how this story works. In fact, we get the conflict right away. I mean, it starts at 100 miles an hour here in chapter 1, and we're going to read that together. So in chapter 1, you're going to see tragedy all over the place, tribulation, trial. Let's read it together. Chapter 1 and verse 1. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Let's stop there for just a moment. Anytime a woman loses her husband, that would be tragic. We probably have all known people that have lost a husband or a wife and how difficult that would be. But even more difficult in this situation, because it could mean death. If your husband is the provider and you no longer have a provider, and think about this, they're off away from the community of Israel. They're away from the nation of Israel. They're not at home. You know, there's provision there we're going to see a little bit later, but they're out and away, as vulnerable and lonely as you might be. And so when Elimelech dies, that is a major issue. But she still has two sons. And she has these daughters-in-law, but they're not Israelites. So then you go along about 10 years, and then both of her sons die. Now think about this. If you're in Naomi's position, and you're off away from home, away from provision, away from protection, and you lost your husband, and then you lost your two sons, and you believe in God, we talked a little bit about this with Habakkuk this morning, what are you going to be thinking? Well, I can tell you what she thought. She said, don't call me a name that would indicate pleasantness. Call me by a name that means bitterness. She's disoriented in her faith. She still has faith, but her thought is, why? Her thought is how God must have turned his hand against her. He must be bringing this affliction on her in some way. And so if you look at verse 3, we read that she was left with her two sons, but they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. And he says, the scripture says the name of the one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And the woman was bereft of her two children and her husband. She's all alone. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab. For she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. Now that says a lot about Naomi. There's no horror story about the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law not getting along here. They loved her. And initially, they're both clinging to her in many ways. So go on with me. As they lift up their voices and they weep, verse 10, they said to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. So initially, not just Ruth, but also Orpah wants to go back with her. They loved her that much. She was that endearing to them. But Naomi said, return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I, and there's rhetorical sarcasm going on here, have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I had hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? There's an issue of levirate law that comes out in this story you might remember from the book of Deuteronomy, in which under that first covenant, if there was the loss of a husband, that the brother-in-law would step in. And every time I talk about this, Rachel says, oh, I just hate to think, I'm glad we're under the new covenant because there's no way I'd ever want to be married to any of my brothers-in-law. But it was for their protection. It was for provision there. And so she kind of uses that sarcasm. Like, what are we going to do? Are you going to wait around that long? And even if that happens, how is this even going to work? This is not a workable situation. Verse 13. No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you. Why? Now, think about that statement. These are Moabite women. And as a Jewish woman, she says, it's harder for me than for you. She's thinking, well, you can go back home and you can marry and you can have a family. For the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. That's what she believes. Can you understand why she might have thought that? Well, in verse 14, they lifted up their voices and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah loves her deeply, but there's something about Ruth, and I want to emphasize this. Here Naomi is, and she feels like God has abandoned her, even afflicting her. But actually, and she'll learn this much later, even while she felt that way, God was working through her Moabitess daughter-in-law to cling to her. God was clinging to Naomi through Ruth in an astonishing way. Sometimes we may feel that God is a long way from us, when actually He's providentially providing. Verse 15, then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. And this is verses 16 and 17, which we had read. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. I want to pause here for just a minute to address something that I'm sure you're aware of. Did you notice what she said? Now, where did she learn about the true and the living God? Where would a Moabitess woman have learned about the true and living God? Well, she would have learned about God from Naomi. Doesn't that say something? Don't you know Naomi had talked to her about the true and the living God versus false gods? I would have imagined she certainly would have done that. She knew who they were serving. But something else I want to mention to you. Notice what it says. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. And there is a fairly, I would say, more prevalent than we would like to imagine idea, even among some who profess strong faith in Christ, that you have your relationship with God in a very individual way. And there's certainly unique responsibilities we have on a personal level before God that nobody else can meet. But their thought is, I'm kind of a Christian at large. And that becoming part of a local congregation, a faithful local congregation, and being part of that spiritual family, if you will, that's a good thing to do, but it's not really all that necessary. Now, you can't get that idea from the New Testament, but I'll tell you this, you can't get that idea from the Old Testament for sure either. This idea of the identity of God's people and their fellowship together as those who would follow the true and living God is from beginning to end in Scripture. This notion that I love God, but I'm not encouraging and helping and strengthening my brothers and sisters and receiving what they can give me as He has designed has never been taught in any of the Scripture. And while I'm here, and this is for free, while I'm here, we hear a lot about worship, and it's so me-centered. Go back to the Old Testament, and you find that, and people act like, well, worship is over here. You can love God and put worship. No, you can't. How do you have fellowship with God and you're not worshiping God? And you go back to the Old Testament, you think about the tabernacle, you think about the temple, and then we come to the Lord's church in New Testament times. Worship is a centerpiece. I'm not saying it's all that there is, but I'm saying it's a large part of who we are as God's people. And so she would say, I want to go with you, and your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. And I think that reveals a great deal about what had been shared with her and her understanding of who God really was. So here's Naomi almost as a representative of God's nation, God's chosen nation. Here is the Moabitess woman clinging to her, Ruth. Naomi was a righteous woman, but she was suffering. Look at the end of Ruth chapter 1 and, verse 18. I love this passage. It says, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, Naomi sees that Ruth is determined to go with her. She said no more to her. She gave up trying to persuade her not to go. So she just says, okay, this is the way it's going to be. Well, then in verse 20, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Now, there's a key passage I want you really to hang on to in verse 21, and we're going to circle right around back and grab it at the end of the lesson. But I actually think it's an important theme. In verse 21, she says, I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Well, she means I had a husband, I had 2 sons, I felt full, but he's bringing me back home empty. Have you ever felt empty? Grief will make you feel empty. She feels like God somehow has turned against her. She says, why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth, and it keeps saying this, Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And there's this little kind of gem here, and we'll come back to, but look at that last statement in verse 22. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's going to be important. That's a provision God made this morning. We talked about God's commandments. God commanded them to observe this barley harvest. It was to be a provision for his people. You know, some of the, I guess you would call them they're not really the classical atheists, the more popular modern day atheists. Many of them will have written books on a popular level that are aimed at our young men and women, to be honest with you. And among those is a man by the name of Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, I'm convinced, just hates God. But he'll give these long lines of God, and they always want to run to the Old Testament. And, you know, here's my thing. If you're going to criticize the Bible, you need to read it first. It should be a rule somewhere. Because often if you go back and look at what they say with the God of the Old Testament, it will be an event that has happened of God's judgment that's been poured out, but they don't ever give you the whole context. So, for instance, regarding the Canaanites, they'll talk about God's judgment on the Canaanites. They will not tell you that God was patient for over 400 years for the Canaanites. They won't tell you about what the Canaanites had done. They will not tell you what the Canaanites did to their own children. They will not tell you they were involved in all kinds of not only sexual immorality, but infanticide. The murder of babies to an idol. Because you see, that doesn't really fit the narrative. They'll complain on one hand about God not intervening. How can God be holy and righteous and not intervene? And yet when he does intervene, they complain about him intervening. I think they're just going to complain no matter what myself. Especially if you're in the denial of the existence of God. And I'm not saying all those situations are easy questions. I'm saying there are questions within a given context, and you have to give the whole context. But one of the things Richard Dawkins says, you know, he wrote a book, and it was entitled The God Delusion. And there were even some atheists that were critical of it, which says something. But he wrote a book called The God Delusion. I really appreciate it. There were some philosophers and theologians who responded, and the name of their book was The Dawkins Delusion, and I appreciated that. And they exposed some of the very things I'm talking about. But one of the things that he says in that book is that God is xenophobic and a racist and a bigot. You know, it would be one thing if you were talking about cultures around Israel, but if we're talking about Israelite culture, did you know if you mistreated your servant in Israelite culture, there was punishment for that? Did you know that there were provisions? You do, because we're talking about a barley harvest. There were provisions for strangers and foreigners. Wait a minute. Xenophobic means some fear of strangers coming in, foreigners. We have Ruth, she's a Moabitess. We have Rahab. There were provisions for strangers and foreigners coming in, even within the nation of Israel. We have a barley harvest here that was commanded and instructed by God for the people for this very kind of thing. And now here we are. Ruth comes in on the scene. And there's the barley harvest. And that leads us right into chapter 2. Come to chapter 2 with me. Now Naomi had a kinsman, of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. I don't think anything about this is by accident. This is by the hand of God, the providence of God. So Boaz is of the family of Elimelech. And Ruth, the Moabitess, says to Naomi in verse 2, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. You think it's an accident she ends up in Boaz's field who's related to Elimelech? I don't. Talking about that barley harvest, Leviticus 19:9 and 10, the Lord says, you shall leave them for the needy and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Now think about that. Often God will say, I am the Lord your God, as we mentioned this morning, who delivered you from Egypt. I am the Lord your God who promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, I am the faithful God. Sometimes that phrase is used of God's judgment, sometimes of his grace and deliverance. Here it would be his grace and deliverance. He says, do this. And so Ruth is going to be able to take advantage of this. Naomi sends her on. And so Ruth finds herself in this field belonging to Boaz, a man related to this family, a man of great wealth and integrity and high character. So look at chapter 2 with me and verse 3. So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech, this noble man of high standing. And Boaz notices Ruth. And I want you to see the character of Boaz and see the character of Ruth. So in chapter 2, and in verse 5, then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? The servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, please let me glean after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. And when you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. Now let me stop there. One of the things we learn about love is what we see from Boaz. He goes above and beyond to take care of her. Sometimes we have the idea that loving God is let's do the bare minimum. No. If you really love somebody, you're going to go above and beyond. Go after the gift that God gave us in Jesus Christ, and we want to do the bare minimum? But then, in verse 10, look at her humility. She knows who she is. She knows she's an outsider. She knows she's a foreigner. She then falls on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me since I am a foreigner? Boaz tells her why. And it wasn't because her lineage looked just right. He says, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been reported to me. And how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. Now, I really want to remember when I told you there's this theme about emptiness and fullness throughout the book of Ruth. Look at verse 12. In verse 12, he says, may the Lord reward your work. Now, Naomi may feel like God's turned on her, but Boaz is looking at this situation and sees the Lord's work in the life of Ruth, it would seem to me. In verse 12, may the Lord reward your work and your wages be what? Be full from the Lord. He sees Ruth and the providence of God. He says, may the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. How is God giving refuge? Look at this. How is God giving refuge to Ruth and even to Naomi through his people. Through his people. But that can only happen with his people when his people do what he said. And so in verse 13, then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I'm not like one of your maidservants. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here, that you may eat the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. He tells his servants not to insult her, to let her glean even among the sheaves. He mentions that they might enjoy that prosperity. He goes on to talk about these things. So she takes up what he gave her. Notice verse 17, she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up, she goes to the city, she goes back to Naomi. And Naomi, remember Naomi, God's left me empty? What does Naomi say? Where'd this come from? And she tells her, the name of the man with whom I work today, verse 19, is Boaz. In verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi is really putting things together, and she's thinking ahead. And she said, you know, he's a relative. So it's not just that he's providing, she's thinking ongoing provision. He's one of our relatives. In fact, she goes a little further, verse 20, he's one of our closest relatives. Now for this to work for them, he has to be the closest relative. But she's thinking he's a very close relative. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest. And she says in verse 22, Naomi does, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids so that others don't fall on you. This is a very good thing. This barley harvest and Boaz and God's goodness for Naomi's sake and for God's purpose. So things at this point you're thinking, okay, we started out really rough, but we're kind of coming around here, and I'm starting to, you can see the fruit of God's provision here and his goodness and his grace. So now as Naomi continues to think about this, she says, should I not seek security for you? So we move from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and it got a little bit better. You know, they're not going to die. Life is sustained. She's with the community. She comes across Boaz. All of this is happening in chapter 2. You move from tragedy striking to life being sustained, but that brings us to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, you'll notice in verse 1, read with me. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? And she wants her to go see Boaz. Now, is not Boaz our kinsman with whose maids you were? Behold, he winters barley at the threshing floor tonight. Verse 3, wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down, and then he will tell you what you shall do. And she says to her, all that you've told me I will do. And she does that. So when Boaz, verse 7, had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man, that's Boaz, was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Let's stop right there for a minute. You know, it's never a good idea to figure out what you believe theologically and biblically from Facebook. That's just a stab in the dark there, but don't do that. But you'll see people post some articles, and some of these men that write these articles that claim to be very scholarly may not even believe in the inspiration of the Bible. And some of them don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible. And you'll get somebody, and they'll take a text like this and say, well, you know what I think? I think that Ruth was offering herself in some kind of sexually immoral way. That this, you'll see this. People will say all sorts of things. And I have to tell you, shame on them. There is nothing ungodly about. First of all, let's just think about the character description in this story. Boaz, how is he described? Upstanding man, high integrity. In fact, in a minute, we're going to find out, he finds out there's one relative that's closer than he is, and as much as he cares about Ruth, we've got to follow what God said. That's the kind of man he was. Secondly, here's Ruth the Moabitess. She's been faithful to God. She's being loyal to her mother-in-law. Why does Boaz love her? Because of her high integrity and character. There's nothing that condemns any of the actions here. There's nothing impure or ungodly at all. Now, is there the thought of marriage here? Sure. Does she want him to know that she cares about him? Yes. Is he thankful to God and sees her high integrity and character and appreciates her and would say, you know, I appreciate you and you could have run after young men, but you didn't? Yes, all of that's in the story, but all of that's godly, brethren. So here is Ruth. And what a touching scene this is. And by the way, that language there in chapter 3 and verse 9, spread your covering over your maid, a very similar phrase is used of God's relationship of his people in the book of Ezekiel. She was asking for protection from an eventual husband. And Boaz appreciated her and loved her. And you can read chapter 3 and verses 10 through 18. Now, I do want to go back and mention one more thing. Remember that empty, full theme? Look at verse 17. She said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, do not go to your mother-in-law what? Empty-handed. I went out full, I feel empty. He says, the Lord rewards you fully. He says, I don't want you to go back to Naomi empty-handed. And now we're talking about marriage. And so in chapter 4, verse 7, we find out about this custom in Israel. And he says there is a man, just when you think, okay, I'm good, everything's come together, it's all going to work out, they're going to get married. But there's a man that's a closer relative. And Boaz says he follows the instructions in this matter, in this custom. He goes and talks to him. And we could talk about why, but the man decides not to take advantage of what he could have taken advantage of. And I mean that in a positive way. And he steps back away from it, and that leaves Boaz. And there's Boaz. And there's Ruth. God working through Boaz, God working through Ruth, God working through Naomi. And what we see now, we've gone from tragedy striking to the healing of restoration. And I want you to look at chapter 4 in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. Can I ask you, you think Naomi feels empty or full? Of course, full. They said he's going to be famous in Israel. Look at verse 15. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. God has worked through Boaz. God has worked through Naomi in helping Ruth in some ways, perhaps to see at least a glimpse of the glory of God. Certainly Ruth is helping Naomi. And there's this little statement I want you to look at in verse 16. Verse 16, then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. I preached this lesson a couple of years ago in a place, and I had for some reason when people have grandkids, they really want to talk to you about them. And there was a sister there, and they had their first grandchild. She, I think, just wanted to talk to me about it, but she came up and she's showing pictures, and then she mentioned this verse, and she said, I love every one of my children, and I can remember the moment when I held my children in my hands, in my arms. But she said, when I held my first grandchild in my arms and looked in his little eyes, she said there was something very uniquely special about that. And that got me to thinking about Naomi. She had a full heart now when she held that grandchild in her arms. She had felt so alone, so vulnerable, so empty. But now she felt full because of God's grace. Look then at verse 16, it goes even further. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. That's interesting. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then look at verse 22. And to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse, David. And when you turn over there to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5, and that genealogy everybody's scared they're going to have to read during scripture reading on Sunday morning, you know whose name shows up there? You do. Ruth's. And let me tell you, you can't get any more full than showing up in the genealogy of the Messiah. So, I only have an hour and a half left, so hang in there. No, I do want to end with these things. Just 3 quick points here. First of all, what do we learn? We learn the Lord's covenant faithfulness. He's faithful to his promise, even when things look very difficult. Secondly, we see redemptive restoration through God's people. I do want to share one poem that a brother wrote entitled The People in the Pew, because I think it illustrates how God can work through his people. He says, the people in the pew, they are parents burdened because of their prodigal children. They are grandparents raising grandchildren because if they don't, who will? They are caregivers wondering if anyone understands. They are smiling faces hoping to hide their depression. They are a childless couple facing disappointment again. They are folks facing both cancer and fears. They are people who have to do the unthinkable and bury a child. They are parents struggling to raise a special needs child. They are brothers and sisters who have done everything they know to keep their marriage going. They are widows and widowers who sit down as one at a table for two. They are sisters who harbor the difficulty of a husband who refuses the gospel. They are step-parents who seem to be on the outside looking in. They are the lonely, the scared, the hurting, but they come. They come to the table to share their grief with the one who gave his all. They come to lift up their voice in song while brushing away a tear. They come to pray and connect with their only hope. They come to encourage someone else while hoping someone else will encourage them. They come to hear the good news and hope to take something away that will be healing. They are the people in the pew. The funny thing is, they look a lot like you and me. Sometimes you need to be a Ruth to a Naomi. Are you willing to do that? So what do we learn finally? We see a divine reversal. We see God doing unbelievable things. We see God taking us from emptiness to fullness. We see him changing mourning into joy, or death into life, or despair into hope, or brokenness into restoration, alienation into fellowship, pain into healing, lostness into redemption, anxiety into peace. And we know God can do all this now. The Lord never fails. Things may look really hard, but the Lord never fails. It may be that you're here this afternoon and you've never obeyed the gospel and you know what the gospel teaches. But when you think about your relationship with God, what you feel is emptiness because you know you've sinned against God and you're out of his fellowship. But you don't have to leave here that way. You don't have to leave empty. You may be empty right now, but you don't have to leave empty. When you leave here this afternoon, if you'll come and obey the gospel of Christ, you'll leave here full. Don't leave here with your soul and your heart empty. Leave here with Christ dwelling in your hearts by faith. Come now, as together we stand and we sing.